The wine glass nearly slipped from my father's hand. For a second, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire private dining room seemed frozen in place as a 4-star general, one of the most respected military leaders in the country, stood directly in front of me with his hand extended. My father had spent the last 10 minutes introducing me as the disappointment of the family, the daughter who had wasted her potential, the daughter who could never measure up to her older sister. But the general wasn't looking at my sister. He wasn't looking at my father. He was looking at me. And then he said the words that changed everything. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady and respectful, "it's an honor to see you again." I watched the color drain from my father's face, because for the first time in my life, he realized there was something about me he didn't know, something he had never bothered to ask. And before that night was over, he would discover that the daughter he had spent years being ashamed of was the very person a 4-star general trusted with his life. My name is Lauren Hayes, and this is how my father spent most of my life believing I was his greatest disappointment. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, in a house where achievement was measured like currency. Everything had a ranking. Everything had a winner. And in my father's eyes, there was never any question about who won. My older sister, Brooke. Brooke was 2 years older than me and seemed born with the ability to impress people. She was captain of the debate team, honor roll every semester, class president, the kind of student teachers remembered years after graduation. Whenever report cards arrived, my father would spread them across the kitchen table like trophies. Brooke's accomplishments became family celebrations. Mine became discussions about how I could do better. It wasn't that I was a bad student. I wasn't. I earned good grades, played sports, worked hard, but in our house good was never enough when someone else was exceptional. At family gatherings, relatives would ask my father how Brooke was doing. His face would light up. He would spend 10 minutes talking about her latest achievement. Then someone would ask about me. The answer was usually much shorter. "Lauren's doing fine. Fine." That word followed me through most of my childhood. Not brilliant, not impressive, not extraordinary, just fine. As I got older, I stopped competing for his approval. It felt like trying to win a race where the finish line kept moving. Brooke eventually attended law school. My father couldn't stop talking about it. He framed her acceptance letter, actually framed it, hung it in his office. People would visit and he'd point to it like it was a piece of fine art. Then came the moment that permanently changed how he looked at me. I told him I was joining the Army. I was 22 years old, fresh out of college, certain about my decision. I still remember sitting across from him at the dining room table. The smell of coffee filled the room. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows. For me, it felt like the beginning of a meaningful future. For him, it looked like a disaster. "The Army?" he asked. "Yes." "Why?" I smiled. "Because I want to serve." The silence that followed felt heavy, disappointed, judgmental. Finally, he leaned back. "Lauren, smart people don't usually choose the military when they have other options." The words landed harder than I expected. "What does that mean?" "It means you could have done something more." "More?" That word stayed with me for years. More successful, more respected, more impressive. According to him, the military was what people chose when they couldn't succeed elsewhere. No matter how many times I explained my reasons, he never understood. Or maybe he never wanted to. Over the next 12 years, our relationship became polite but distant. Phone calls on holidays, birthday messages, occasional visits, nothing terrible, nothing close. When Brooke made partner at her law firm, my father hosted a celebration dinner. When I earned my promotion to major, he sent a text, "Congratulations." That was it. No phone call, no questions, no curiosity, just congratulations, as if I had completed an online course. Sometimes I wondered whether he even knew what my job involved. Then again, he never asked. Brooke's life was easy for him to understand. Law firms, courtrooms, professional success, those fit neatly into the world he valued. My career existed somewhere outside his understanding, a place he had already decided wasn't worth exploring. Then Brooke met Michael Reynolds. Michael was successful, intelligent, and came from one of the most respected military families in America. The moment my father learned who Michael's father was, something changed. Suddenly he became obsessed. General Richard Reynolds, 4 stars, decorated career, national reputation. To my father, that sounded like royalty. The engagement happened 8 months later. From that point forward, every conversation revolved around wedding plans, family introductions, and social events. 3 weeks before the engagement dinner, my father called me. I was finishing paperwork at Fort Belvoir when my phone vibrated. I almost ignored it. Almost. "Hi, Dad." "Lauren." His voice already sounded tense. I leaned back in my chair. "Everything okay?" "Listen carefully." That wasn't how normal conversations started. "I'm listening." There was a pause. Then he said it. "Don't embarrass your sister." I blinked. "What?" "The dinner." "What about it?" "Michael's father is a 4-star general." I stared at the wall, unsure where this was going. "Okay. So, just be careful." "Careful doing what?" Another pause. Then came the answer. "Don't make everything about your military stories." I laughed once, not because it was funny, because it was absurd. "Dad, I never talk about my work." "I know. Just keep it that way." I felt something tighten in my chest, the familiar ache of being underestimated again, always. "You don't have to worry." "Good." Then he added the part that hurt most. "Brooke deserves a night where all the attention stays on her." As if I spent my life trying to steal it. As if I had ever wanted the spotlight. As if 12 years of quiet service somehow made me attention-seeking. After we hung up, I sat alone in my office. The building was nearly empty. Outside, evening sunlight stretched across the parking lot. I should have been angry. Instead, I felt tired. Tired of being judged by someone who knew almost nothing about me. Tired of being measured against a sister who wasn't even competing. Brooke wasn't the problem. The problem was that my father had spent decades believing love and pride were resources that needed to be rationed. And somehow, I had always received the smaller portion. The week before the dinner passed quickly. My responsibilities kept me busy. Meetings, reports, training schedules, the usual demands of military life. Still, every so often my father's words returned. "Don't embarrass your sister." I wondered if he had any idea how little he knew about the woman saying yes to that invitation, the woman he still saw as a disappointment. By Friday evening, I packed a small bag and drove toward Richmond. The familiar roads carried me back to a family that had never fully understood me. I told myself the dinner would be simple. Show up, smile, celebrate Brooke, go home. Nothing more. I had no idea that within 24 hours, a secret buried for over a year would begin to surface. And when it did, everything my father believed about me would start to unravel. The drive from Virginia back to Richmond should have felt familiar. Instead, I spent most of it thinking about my father's voice. "Don't embarrass your sister." The words weren't new. They belonged to a pattern that stretched across decades. My father had always assumed I was one wrong sentence away from disappointing someone. What he didn't know was that disappointing people had become one of the easiest things in my life. Not because I enjoyed it, because military service teaches you very quickly that approval is temporary. Mission success matters, character matters. The opinions of people who don't understand your job matter far less than most civilians imagine. Still, family is different. Even when you've learned to stop expecting validation, part of you never completely stops wanting it. By the time I arrived at my hotel that evening, Richmond's skyline was glowing beneath a fading orange sunset. I checked in, carried my overnight bag upstairs, and sat on the edge of the bed. The room was quiet. For the first time all day, there was nothing demanding my attention. No reports, no briefings, no decisions, just silence. My eyes drifted toward the framed mirror across the room. The woman looking back at me didn't resemble the disappointment my father imagined. The reflection showed someone who had spent 12 years carrying responsibilities most people would never see. 12 years of deployments, 12 years of sacrifices, 12 years of learning how quickly life could change. I thought about Afghanistan, the mountains, the dust, the endless stretches of terrain that looked beautiful from a distance and deadly up close. I thought about Iraq. Long nights, convoys, the constant awareness that routine could become chaos without warning. Then, Syria. The mission that changed everything. The mission nobody in my family knew about. Most of my relatives assumed I spent my military career sitting behind desks. Some imagined I handled paperwork. Others guessed logistics. Nobody asked enough questions to discover the truth. And because of security restrictions, I couldn't volunteer much information. The result was simple. My silence became mistaken for mediocrity. The truth was very different. Over the years, I had earned commendations I never discussed. A Bronze Star, a Legion of Merit, several operational awards. Not because I was extraordinary, because I worked alongside extraordinary people and did my job. That was all. Military culture teaches humility differently than civilian life. You don't spend much time talking about your accomplishments when everyone around you has their own scars and sacrifices. You simply move forward, one mission after another, one responsibility after another, one day after another. But there was one mission I remembered more clearly than the others. A mission from 14 months earlier. A mission that would unexpectedly connect me to the Reynolds family. I still remembered the heat. The air felt heavy enough to drink. Our team had been overseeing the movement of several high-value personnel through a volatile region. Most details remained classified, even now. What mattered was this. Everything had been proceeding according to plan. Then it wasn't. The first explosion struck near the front of the convoy. The sound ripped through the valley. Dust erupted, vehicles swerved, radio traffic exploded with overlapping voices. Training takes over during moments like that. You don't have time for fear. You react, assess, adapt, move. I began coordinating evacuation routes while incoming fire echoed across the landscape. The situation deteriorated quickly. One vehicle became separated from the main group. Several civilians were trapped. Among them was a senior government advisor traveling under limited visibility protocols. At the time, I didn't know his name, didn't know his position, didn't know why he was there. I only knew people needed help. Our team moved immediately. Minutes later, we reached the isolated vehicle. I still remember opening the armored door. Smoke drifted through the air. Everyone inside looked stunned. One man in particular stood out. Older, calm despite the circumstances, observant. Even in chaos, he seemed focused. We extracted everyone and moved them toward a safer position. The entire operation lasted less than an hour, but those 60 minutes felt much longer. By the end, everyone survived, which was all that mattered. Several days later, I learned the identity of one of the civilians, General Richard Reynolds. At that point, he was still active in several strategic advisory roles. The revelation surprised me, not because of his rank, because during the evacuation he had behaved like everyone else. Professional, respectful, grateful, no ego, no special treatment, just another person trying to get home safely. A week later, he requested a brief meeting. Nothing formal, just a conversation. I expected it to last 5 minutes. It lasted nearly 40. We spoke about leadership, service, responsibility, the burden of decision-making, topics military professionals often understand without lengthy explanations. Before leaving, he shook my hand. "I hope our paths cross again someday, Major Hayes." I smiled. "Hopefully under less exciting circumstances, sir." He laughed. "That would be nice." Neither of us expected the next meeting to happen at my sister's engagement dinner. Back in the hotel room, my phone vibrated. An email notification appeared. At first, I ignored it. Then I noticed the sender, Richard Reynolds. I opened it. The message was brief, professional, direct. "Major Hayes, I understand we may both be attending the Reynolds-Hayes engagement dinner tomorrow evening. I look forward to seeing you again. Respectfully, Richard Reynolds." I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I smiled. Apparently, he remembered. Most people in positions of power meet thousands of individuals throughout their careers. The fact that he remembered our conversation spoke volumes about his character. I considered mentioning it to my father. The thought lasted perhaps 3 seconds. No, there was no point. If I told him now, it would sound like bragging. Besides, the evening wasn't supposed to be about me. It was Brooke's celebration. Nothing more. The next morning, I met Brooke for coffee. We hadn't spent much time alone lately. Wedding planning had consumed most of her schedule. When she arrived, she looked exhausted, beautiful, happy, but exhausted. I smiled. "You look like someone who's planning a wedding." She groaned. "I look like someone being held hostage by floral arrangements." That made me laugh. For the next hour, we talked like sisters. Not competitors, not rivals, just sisters. The way we'd always been when our father wasn't turning life into a scoreboard. Eventually, she stirred her coffee and looked at me. You know Dad means well. There it was, the subject neither of us had mentioned. I sighed. Does he? She hesitated. He gets carried away. That's one way to describe it. Brooke looked down. For a moment, she seemed uncomfortable. I know he compares us. I didn't answer because denying it would be dishonest, and confirming it would make her feel guilty. Neither outcome seemed useful. Finally, she said quietly, I never wanted that. My expression softened. I know. And I did know. Brooke wasn't responsible for our father's choices. She never asked to be the favorite. In many ways, she carried her own burden. Being placed on a pedestal isn't always a gift. Sometimes it's just another kind of pressure. When we left the cafe, she hugged me. I'm glad you're here. I hugged her back. Me too. As I watched her walk away, I felt something unexpected. Peace. No resentment, no jealousy, just genuine happiness for my sister. That feeling remained with me throughout the afternoon. By evening, I was getting ready for the engagement dinner. I chose a simple navy blue dress. Nothing flashy, no military decorations, no symbols of rank, no indication of the life I'd spent building. Just Lauren, the version of me my family rarely noticed. As I fastened a small pair of earrings and prepared to leave the hotel, my phone buzzed once more. A text message, unknown number. I opened it. Looking forward to tonight, Rich Reynolds. I shook my head and laughed softly. If my father could see that message, he probably wouldn't believe it. Then again, there were many things my father wouldn't believe, at least not yet, because in just a few hours, everyone would gather around the same dinner table. My father would proudly introduce his future in-laws. He would celebrate Brooke. He would talk about success, reputation, and status. And sitting quietly among the guests would be the one person in the room whose story he knew the least. By 6:30 that evening, the private dining room at the Jefferson Club was already filling with guests. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm golden light across polished wood walls. Waiters moved quietly between tables, carrying trays of wine and appetizers, while clusters of guests exchanged greetings and business cards. It was exactly the kind of event my father loved. Not because of the celebration itself, because of the audience. My father had always enjoyed being surrounded by successful people. The more impressive the room, the more energized he became. And tonight, he was practically glowing. The future son-in-law was a successful attorney. The future in-laws belonged to one of the most respected military families in America. The guest list included judges, partners from law firms, physicians, executives, and retired military officers. To my father, it was the perfect stage. I arrived a few minutes early. Brooke spotted me first. You made it. Wouldn't miss it. She smiled and pulled me into a hug. For a moment, she looked nervous. Please tell me nobody's fighting tonight. I laughed. I'll do my best. She pointed toward the bar. Dad's already on his third speech. That didn't surprise me. Across the room, I could see him moving from group to group. His posture was straighter than usual. His smile was wider. His voice carried farther. Every few minutes, someone laughed at something he said. My mother stood nearby, smiling politely, while occasionally adjusting the sleeves of her dress. She looked beautiful. She also looked tired. I had seen that expression before. The expression of someone trying to keep peace without making waves. When my father finally noticed me, he walked over. For a second, I hoped the conversation might be different. Maybe age had softened him. Maybe Brooke had spoken to him. Maybe tonight would simply be a celebration. Then he opened his mouth. You wore something appropriate. The hope disappeared instantly. I smiled anyway. Good to see you too, Dad. He glanced around. You understand this is an important evening? I do. No military debates. I stared at him. What military debates? He waved a dismissive hand. You know what I mean. Actually, I didn't. Because in 12 years, I had never once attended a family event and started discussing military strategy with strangers, but correcting him felt pointless. So I simply nodded. Understood. He seemed satisfied. Then he moved on to greet another guest, as if he'd completed an important task. My mother touched my arm after he left. "I'm glad you're here." Her voice was gentle, always gentle. I kissed her cheek. "I'm glad too." She hesitated. Then she squeezed my hand. A small gesture, but somehow it meant more than all of my father's speeches combined. Over the next half-hour, guests continued arriving. Michael greeted everyone warmly. Brooke looked radiant. Conversations flowed easily. For a while, I actually enjoyed myself. I spoke with a retired Navy commander, a physician from Johns Hopkins, a couple who had known Michael's family for years. Nobody treated me like a disappointment. Nobody seemed concerned about whether I was impressive enough. People simply talked, listened, connected, the way adults usually do. Then dinner began. Guests found their seats around several large tables arranged in a semicircle. My father stood near the front, wine glass in hand, the unofficial master of ceremonies. I immediately recognized the look in his eyes. He was preparing a speech, or several. The room gradually quieted. Forks settled. Conversation stopped. My father cleared his throat. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Polite applause followed. He launched into a long tribute to Brooke and Michael. To be fair, much of it was heartfelt. He spoke about Brooke's intelligence, her work ethic, her accomplishments. He praised Michael's integrity, his character, his promising future. Everyone smiled. Brooke looked embarrassed but happy. So far, everything was fine. Then my father began introducing family members. And that's when the evening started changing. He pointed toward my mother first. The room applauded politely. Then Brooke. More applause. Then several relatives. Everything proceeded normally until his eyes landed on me. I felt a familiar knot form in my stomach. Not fear, recognition. The instinctive realization that something uncomfortable was coming. My father smiled, not warmly, performatively. "Of course, many of you haven't met my younger daughter, Lauren." Several guests turned toward me. I smiled politely. A few nodded. Then my father chuckled, and everything went wrong. "This is Lauren." He paused dramatically. "The family disappointment?" For a second, nobody reacted. I think people assumed they had misheard. Then a few awkward laughs emerged. Uncertain, confused, the kind of laughter people use when they aren't sure whether something is a joke. My smile froze. Across the room, Brooke immediately lowered her eyes. My mother's shoulders visibly tensed, but my father continued, completely unaware of the damage he was doing. Brooke got all the ambition. More nervous laughter. Lauren always preferred taking the scenic route. The knot in my stomach tightened. Years ago, comments like that would have devastated me. Tonight, they simply felt exhausting. The room shifted uncomfortably. People glanced at one another. Nobody seemed eager to participate. Yet my father kept going. You know how every family has one child who follows the plan and another who decides to reinvent the wheel? Several guests smiled politely. My father pointed toward Brooke. "That's the successful one." Then toward me. "And that's Lauren." The humiliation wasn't in the words themselves. It was in the familiarity. The realization that even at 34 years old, I was still being introduced like a cautionary tale, still being compared, still being measured, still being found lacking. I reached for my water glass, not because I was upset, because keeping my hands occupied helped maintain composure. Across the table, one guest gave me a sympathetic look. Another seemed genuinely uncomfortable. A retired Marine colonel frowned openly. My father never noticed. He was too busy performing. Eventually, he moved on to other subjects, but the damage lingered. The atmosphere had changed. People weren't laughing anymore. They were observing, evaluating, trying to understand why a father would publicly belittle his own daughter. I focused on Brooke. She looked miserable, and suddenly I felt sorry for her. This wasn't the evening she wanted. This wasn't the memory she deserved. I decided then that no matter what happened next, I wouldn't create a scene. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't defend myself. I wouldn't take attention away from her celebration. Dinner continued. Salads arrived. Wine was poured. Conversations gradually resumed. The tension began to fade. Then the doors opened. Everything stopped. Even before I turned around, I sensed the shift. A ripple moving through the room, heads turning, voices lowering, people sitting straighter. I looked toward the entrance. General Richard Reynolds had arrived, tall, distinguished, confident without appearing arrogant, the kind of presence that naturally commanded respect. My father nearly jumped out of his chair. His face lit up instantly. This was the moment he had been waiting for all evening. He hurried across the room with an enthusiasm usually reserved for lottery winners. General Reynolds. The two men shook hands. My father looked thrilled, almost starstruck. Several guests watched with obvious interest. The general greeted him politely, then his eyes moved across the room, slowly, methodically, scanning faces, searching. And then he saw me. The change was immediate. His expression brightened with genuine recognition. Without hesitation, he excused himself from my father and began walking directly toward my table. My father stopped talking, confused. The room grew quieter. Guests followed the general's path with their eyes. I remained seated, calm, though my pulse had started to rise because I suddenly realized what was about to happen. Richard Reynolds reached my table, stopped directly beside my chair, and smiled. The entire room watched. My father watched. Brooke watched. My mother watched. Then the four-star general extended his hand toward me and spoke the words that would shatter every assumption my father had ever made. "Major Hayes," he said warmly, "it's good to see you again." For a moment, nobody in the room seemed capable of breathing. The silence wasn't ordinary silence. It was the kind that follows a sudden shock, the kind that makes people question whether they heard something correctly. My father stood frozen halfway between the entrance and our table. His smile had vanished. His eyes moved from General Reynolds to me and back again, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. I rose from my chair and accepted the general's hand. "It's good to see you too, sir." The general smiled. Then he did something unexpected, something that made the room even quieter. He held my hand for a moment and said, "I was hoping you'd be here tonight." The words were simple, but the respect behind them was unmistakable. This wasn't a powerful man politely acknowledging an acquaintance. This was genuine regard, the kind that cannot be faked. My father finally found his voice. "You know Lauren?" The question came out weak, almost fragile. General Reynolds turned toward him. For a brief second I considered stepping in, redirecting the conversation, protecting my father from what was coming. Then I remembered the speech, the laughter, the words, family disappointment, and I stayed silent. Not out of revenge, out of truth. The general nodded. "Yes, I do." Another pause. Then he added, "Quite well, actually." The room remained motionless. No one reached for a glass. No one resumed conversation. Even the waitstaff seemed to sense something important unfolding. My father attempted a nervous laugh. "That's surprising." General Reynolds tilted his head slightly. "Why?" My father opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. For perhaps the first time in his life, he seemed uncertain about what to say. "I just didn't realize the two of you had crossed paths." The general's expression softened. Then he looked at me. Crossed paths is one way to describe it. Several guests exchanged glances. Curiosity was spreading throughout the room. Michael had moved closer. Brooke looked completely bewildered. My mother sat perfectly still. The general pulled out a chair and sat beside our table, not at the head of the room, not beside the most important guests, beside me. That decision alone seemed to confuse my father more than anything else. Then Richard Reynolds looked around the room. "I suspect Major Hayes hasn't shared much about her career." A few people smiled politely. My father answered before anyone else could. "Lauren has always been very private." The general chuckled. "That's because the most impressive people often are." I saw my father's face tighten, not with anger, with uncertainty. His understanding of the evening was beginning to crumble. General Reynolds folded his hands together. "You know there are certain moments in life that stay with you forever." Nobody interrupted. The room had become his audience. 14 months ago, I was part of a strategic delegation traveling through a region that became unexpectedly hostile. I immediately knew where this was heading. So hostile, he continued, that several of us were fortunate to leave alive. The room became even quieter. Michael stared at his father. Brooke looked at me, confused, concerned, trying to connect pieces she didn't possess. The general continued. Our convoy came under attack. A few guests visibly stiffened. My team was separated. Communications became unreliable. The situation deteriorated very quickly. Then he looked directly at me, and Major Lauren Hayes took command. The words landed like thunder. I saw my father's shoulders go rigid. The retired Marine colonel at the neighboring table suddenly leaned forward. Now he understood. Military people always recognize certain details immediately. Leadership during crisis, command responsibility. The weight behind those words. General Reynolds continued calmly. Most people imagine courage as something dramatic. He paused. But real courage is often very quiet. His eyes remained on me. Real courage is making decisions when lives depend on those decisions. No one moved. No one spoke. My father looked as though he had forgotten how. During that operation, the general said, Major Hayes coordinated the evacuation of multiple personnel under active threat. He smiled slightly, and she did so with remarkable composure. The retired colonel nodded, almost involuntarily. A professional recognizing another professional. General Reynolds leaned back. To be perfectly honest, I wasn't concerned about myself that day. A few people looked surprised. I was concerned about the younger personnel traveling with us. His voice softened. The major made certain every one of them returned home. The room remained completely still. Then came the sentence that changed everything. If she hadn't been there, I might not be sitting in this room tonight. My father's wine glass slipped. Not completely, but enough. The stem struck the table. Several drops splashed onto the white linen cloth. Nobody paid attention. Every eye remained fixed on General Reynolds. And on me. My father stared as though he were looking at a stranger. Not because he doubted the general, because he suddenly realized how little he knew about his own daughter. The general continued speaking. But now his voice carried something personal. Respect, gratitude, memory. In my career, I've worked with exceptional leaders. He paused. Generals, admirals, diplomats, commanders. Then he smiled at me. And Major Hayes belongs in that company? The words struck harder than any medal ever had. Not because of the praise, because of who was hearing it. My family. The people who had never asked. The people who had assumed silence meant insignificance. Brooke's eyes glistened slightly. My mother lowered her head. One hand moved to her mouth. Emotion flickered across her face. My father simply stared. The certainty that had defined him all evening was gone, replaced by confusion, regret, disbelief. The general wasn't finished. He turned toward my father. His tone remained polite, professional, but there was unmistakable weight behind his words. Mr. Scott, you've raised an extraordinary daughter. The statement seemed to physically hit him. I watched his throat move, watched him struggle to respond. Finally, he managed a weak thank you. General Reynolds nodded. I mean that sincerely. Then he looked around the room. I've spent my life evaluating people under pressure. He paused. And pressure reveals character. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dared. When things became dangerous, Major Hayes wasn't thinking about recognition. He smiled. She was thinking about responsibility. The retired colonel lifted his glass slightly, a silent military gesture of respect. Others followed, not because they fully understood the mission, because they understood the meaning. Service, sacrifice, duty, concepts larger than titles, larger than income, larger than status. For years, my father had measured success using visible achievements, promotions, degrees, professional prestige. Tonight, he was being introduced to a different definition, one that couldn't be framed on a wall, one that couldn't be displayed during cocktail conversations, one built quietly over years of service. The general eventually shifted the conversation back toward Brooke and Michael. He was gracious enough not to make the entire evening about me. But the atmosphere had already changed. Completely. People approached me throughout dinner. Not because a general had praised me, because they suddenly saw me differently. As a person worth knowing. A person with a story. A person whose life extended beyond their assumptions. Meanwhile, my father grew quieter with every passing minute. By dessert, he had barely spoken. The confident host who had dominated the room earlier seemed to have disappeared. In his place sat a man confronting an uncomfortable reality. The daughter he had spent years comparing, years underestimating, years dismissing, might actually be the strongest person in the family. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea what to do with that realization. The dinner ended shortly after 10 o'clock. Guests lingered near the exits, exchanging hugs, handshakes, and promises to stay in touch. The energy in the room had changed dramatically from the beginning of the evening. Earlier, people had been talking about law firms, business deals, and wedding plans. Now, they were talking about service, leadership, character, and every few minutes someone would stop me to say, "Thank you for your service." I accepted the comments politely, then redirected attention back to Brooke whenever possible. It was still her night. It deserved to remain her night. General Reynolds understood that better than anyone. Before leaving, he found me near the entrance. "I hope I didn't make things difficult." I smiled. "You didn't." He glanced across the room toward my father. "I suspect there may be some conversations ahead." I followed his gaze. My father stood alone near a window, not speaking, not smiling, just staring into the darkness outside. For the first time all evening, he looked old, not physically, emotionally, like someone carrying a weight he didn't know how to set down. General Reynolds extended his hand. "It was good seeing you again, Major." "You too, sir." He shook his head. "Lauren?" I laughed. "Lauren, then." His smile widened. Then he left. A few minutes later, Brooke approached. She wrapped her arms around me before saying a single word. I hugged her back. Neither of us spoke immediately. Sometimes silence communicates more honestly than language. When she finally stepped away, her eyes were damp. "You never told me." "There wasn't much to tell." She stared at me. "Lauren, Dad practically framed my law degree." I laughed softly. "That's true. And meanwhile, you're out saving generals." The absurdity of the comparison made us both smile. Then her expression became serious. "I'm sorry." I shook my head. "You don't owe me an apology." "I know." She paused. "But I still wish things had been different." "So did I." For both of us, because favoritism hurts everyone involved. The overlooked child carries the rejection. The favored child carries the expectations. Neither experience is wonderful as people imagine. Brooke squeezed my hand. "I've always been proud of you." The words hit harder than I expected. Not because I doubted her, because I suddenly realized how rarely I'd heard them. Proud of you. 3 simple words. Yet they carried years of meaning. "Thank you," I said quietly. She smiled. Then Michael appeared beside her. "I think my father likes you more than he likes me." That earned a genuine laugh. The first completely carefree laugh I'd had all night. Eventually they left. My mother left shortly afterward, which meant only 2 people remained in the nearly empty dining room. My father and me. For several minutes, neither of us moved. The staff began clearing tables. Chairs scraped softly across the floor. Outside rain had started falling against the windows. Finally, my father walked toward me. Slowly, without his usual confidence, without his usual certainty. He stopped a few feet away. For a man who always seemed to have an opinion, he suddenly looked lost. I don't know where to begin. I waited. Years ago, I would have rushed to make him comfortable. Not anymore. Some truths deserve space. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. I didn't know. No? His voice cracked slightly. I really didn't know. The sadness in that statement surprised me, because it wasn't an excuse. It was regret. A realization. The painful understanding that he had spent years not asking, years assuming, years deciding who I was without ever learning who I had become. You never asked, I said softly. The words weren't angry. That made them harder. His eyes closed briefly. I know. Rain tapped against the windows. The room felt smaller now, quieter, more honest. My father pulled out a chair and sat down. For the first time in my memory, he looked vulnerable. Not like a parent, just a man confronting his mistakes. When you joined the army, he began, I thought you were throwing your future away. I listened. I had this picture in my head of what success looked like. A bitter smile crossed his face. And I couldn't see anything beyond it. The honesty surprised me. Most people defend themselves when confronted with failure. My father wasn't defending anything. He was admitting it. I kept waiting for you to prove me right. His voice lowered. Every year. Another pause. And every year I paid less attention. The words hurt, not because they were new, because they confirmed what I'd always suspected. He looked at me carefully. As terrible as this sounds, I stopped being curious about your life. I appreciated the truth, even when it was painful, especially when it was painful, because truth offers something excuses never can, a chance to move forward. My father swallowed hard. When General Reynolds started talking tonight, he shook his head. I realized I didn't know my own daughter. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then I finally said the thing I'd carried for years. The hardest part wasn't being compared to Brooke. His eyes lifted. It wasn't no. I took a slow breath. The hardest part was feeling like you weren't interested. Emotion flashed across his face, raw and immediate. I was interested. Were you? The question hung between us, because interest isn't something people feel. It's something they show through questions, through attention, through effort. My father looked away, and in that silence, he answered. At last he nodded. No, his voice broke. I wasn't. For a moment I thought he might cry. Then he did. Just slightly. A few tears. Nothing dramatic. Nothing theatrical. But real. And somehow, that made them more powerful. I missed so much. Yes. I'm sorry. There it was. The apology I had imagined 100 different ways over the years. When it finally arrived, it wasn't satisfying. It wasn't triumphant. It was simply sad. Because apologies cannot return lost time. They cannot recreate missed conversations. They cannot rebuild years. They can only open a door. The rest depends on what happens next. I reached across the table, placed my hand over his, the same hand that had nearly dropped a wine glass earlier that evening, the same hand that had spent years pointing toward my failures, now trembling slightly beneath mine. We can't change the past, he nodded, but we can change tomorrow. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he squeezed my hand, and for the first time in many years I felt something shifting between us. Not complete healing, not instant forgiveness, something more realistic. A beginning. 3 months later, my father attended a military ceremony, my ceremony. I had been selected for an assignment carrying significant responsibility and recognition. The auditorium was filled with service members, families, and senior leaders. As I stood on the stage, I glanced into the audience. My mother sat in the front row, Brooke beside her, Michael beside Brooke, and next to them sat my father, proud, unashamed, present. When my name was called, the audience applauded. But one person stood before anyone else, my father. His hands came together first. His smile appeared first. His pride appeared first. And this time, it wasn't because someone important told him who I was. It was because he finally knew. People often think revenge is about humiliation, about proving someone wrong, about watching another person suffer. But the sweetest revenge I've ever known was much quieter. It was living my life with integrity, serving without recognition, growing without permission, and becoming the person I was meant to be regardless of who believed in me. Because eventually, the truth has a way of introducing itself, and when it does, it speaks louder than any argument ever could. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever felt overlooked by someone whose approval mattered to you? Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your stories matter too. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about family resilience and second chances, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There are many more journeys ahead, and I'd be honored to share them with you.